He thought humiliating her would be entertaining. He expected laughter, mockery, and a show of power. But what he got instead was silence. Not the awkward, pitiful kind. No, this silence was heavy, electrified, filled with something undeniable, and it was all because of her voice. Monroe's Prime wasn't just a restaurant. It was a spectacle. A place where power whispered through the clinking of wine glasses and the rustling of designer suits, where men like Jonathan Pierce, a venture capitalist with a taste for dominance, sat at corner booths, basking in the glow of their own importance. He never heard the word no, and if he did, he made sure the person regretted saying it. Across the room, Elena Carter moved with quiet precision, balancing a tray with effortless grace. She had been working here for 3 years, long enough to recognize the kind of man Jonathan was, the kind who saw waitstaff as background noise. And that was perfectly fine with her, because if she could just make it through another shift, collect her tips, and go home, that would be enough. But Jonathan Pierce was in a good mood tonight, the kind of mood where he wanted to make someone squirm, just for fun. And Elena, she was about to become his entertainment. What happened next would leave every single person in that restaurant speechless. Before we get into this story, if you love powerful narratives that make you think, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and stay until the very end. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The scent of seared steak and aged wine filled the air, mingling with the hum of hushed conversations and the occasional clink of crystal glassware. Monroe's Prime was at its peak dinner hour, a sanctuary for the elite, where fortunes were discussed over filet mignon, and power was measured not in words, but in the weight of a watch, the cut of a suit, the effortless way a man commanded attention. At the center of it all, Jonathan Pierce lounged in his booth, a king among lesser men. His Rolex glinted under the chandelier's golden glow as he swirled his wine lazily, watching the deep red liquid coat the glass in slow, deliberate waves. Around him, his business associates laughed too loudly, their conversation carrying over the more restrained murmurs of the restaurant. They had just closed a deal worth 8 figures, a success that demanded celebration. And Jonathan? He liked his celebrations with a little cruelty. Across the room, Elena Carter moved like clockwork, her steps measured, her hands steady as she placed a fresh round of drinks on a nearby table. She had worked here long enough to know which customers to acknowledge with a polite nod, and which ones to avoid altogether. Jonathan Pierce? He belonged to the second category. He was the kind of man who thrived on making people feel small, just to watch them scramble to regain their dignity. But tonight, Elena had no choice but to step into his orbit. She approached his table, tray balanced effortlessly, eyes downcast, carefully placing each drink in front of the men without disrupting their conversation. But Jonathan wasn't about to let her go that easily. "Hey, sweetheart." His voice cut through the air, smooth, but laced with something else. Amusement, calculation, a predator toying with his prey. Elena froze for half a second before regaining her composure, lifting her gaze just enough to acknowledge him without truly engaging. "Yes, sir?" Her voice was polite, professional, detached. Jonathan tilted his head, studying her like she was an oddity he couldn't quite figure out. His lips curved into a smirk. "You've been awfully quiet all night," he mused, tapping his ring against the side of his glass. No smile, no small talk. "What? You don't like serving people like us?" A chuckle rippled through the table. The other men smirked, some leaning back, waiting to see how she would respond. Elena didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like this before. Men who thrived on power trips, who mistook cruelty for charm. She kept her expression neutral, her voice even. "Just focused on doing my job, sir." Jonathan's smirk widened. "Focused, huh?" He let the word hang in the air, savoring the moment. Then, as if the idea had just occurred to him, he snapped his fingers. "You know what? I think we need some entertainment." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. eyes locked onto Elena like a cat watching a mouse. "How about, you sing for us?" The words hit like a slap. Elena's fingers tightened around the tray. The laughter at the table swelled. Across the restaurant, other diners glanced over, some curious, others shifting in discomfort as they realized what was happening. Jonathan's grin widened. "Come on, don't look so serious. I'm sure you've got some kind of talent. Or is it just carrying plates?" The humiliation was meant to be public, loud, a performance for his audience. But what Jonathan didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Elena Carter had a voice that could stop time. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of silverware scraping against porcelain, the low murmur of the restaurant, the faint clinking of ice in half-finished drinks. But at Jonathan Pierce's table, everything had come to a halt. The men watched Elena, waiting, expecting. She felt the weight of their eyes, the silent pressure of the room closing in on her. This wasn't a request. It was a spectacle. A game where the rules were already written, and she was meant to lose. If she refused, she'd be the bitter, humorless waitress who couldn't take a joke. If she sang, she'd be nothing more than their entertainment, reduced to a novelty for their amusement. Jonathan smirked, leaning back in his chair, swirling his wine with lazy satisfaction. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice rich with mock concern. "Stage fright?" Laughter. Low. Cruel. Elena's grip on the tray tightened, but her face remained unreadable. The room had gone quiet enough that she could feel the tension thickening, pressing against her like an invisible force. Across the restaurant, the hostess shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward the bar. The manager stood near the entrance, arms crossed, debating whether to step in. But no one did. No one ever did. Jonathan's fingers tapped against the table, waiting, enjoying the suspense. Then, just as he was about to open his mouth again, Elena inhaled, and she sang. The first note was soft, delicate, barely above a whisper, but even in its quietness, it had weight, depth. It cut through the air like a blade, slicing through the laughter, the arrogance, the suffocating expectation. Jonathan's smirk faltered. The melody grew, swelling with effortless grace, filling the space between tables, creeping into every corner of the room. It wasn't just a song. It was a reckoning, a force that couldn't be ignored. Elena didn't just sing, she commanded. Her voice was velvet and fire, honey and steel, carrying something raw, something too real for a place as hollow as this. The kind of voice that didn't ask for attention. It demanded it. The restaurant changed in an instant. A waiter, mid-step, froze. Wine bottles suspended in the air. A woman at the bar, lipstick poised against her martini glass, forgot to take a sip. Conversations died mid-sentence as heads turned, drawn in, helpless against the gravity of the moment. Jonathan Pierce, for the first time that night, maybe for the first time in his life, wasn't in control. His men had gone silent. The once amused smirks had disappeared. And as Elena's voice soared, carrying notes that no one had expected, she did something Jonathan never saw coming. She looked directly at him, not with defiance, not with anger, with pity. And in that moment, the power shifted. The final note hung in the air, stretching across the room like an invisible force, the kind that demanded to be felt, the kind that settled deep in your chest and refused to leave. For the first time since Jonathan Pierce had spoken, there was no laughter, no sneers, no arrogance, just silence. A silence so complete, so heavy, that it crushed the weight of his earlier mockery. Elena hadn't begged for approval. She hadn't played into their game. She had done something far worse. She had taken control of it. A slow, deliberate clap broke the silence. A woman at a nearby table, then another, and another. Within seconds, the room erupted. The applause wasn't polite. It wasn't the forced, obligatory kind that came at the end of a mediocre performance. It was raw, unfiltered, real. People weren't just impressed, they were moved. At the bar, a man let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. A couple near the entrance stood up, clapping even harder, as if trying to give justice to what they had just witnessed. Even the kitchen staff had pushed open the doors, peeking through, eyes wide. Jonathan Pierce? He hadn't moved. His fingers were still curled around his untouched glass of wine, his jaw tight, his face unreadable. The once smug expression had vanished. The joke was no longer funny. The money, the pile of $100 bills he had tossed onto the table as a cheap insult, suddenly looked pathetic. One of his colleagues, clearly uncomfortable now, quietly reached forward and slid his bill back into his pocket. Jonathan finally blinked, as if shaking off a spell, and tried to recover. He cleared his throat, sat up straighter, forced a smirk back onto his lips. "Well," he started, but his voice cracked. He immediately hated how weak it sounded. Not that it mattered. No one was listening. Elena had already turned away, weaving through the restaurant like nothing had happened. And somehow, that made it worse. She didn't look back to see his reaction. She didn't soak in the applause. She didn't acknowledge him at all, because he didn't matter. And that was the real humiliation. If you've ever seen arrogance get shattered in real time, you know how satisfying this moment was. If you're loving this story, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and tell me, what would you have done if you were in Elena's place? And of course, subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The applause slowly faded, but the weight of what had just happened remained. Conversations resumed, but with a different energy, a shift that couldn't be ignored. Some guests stole glances at Elena as she moved between tables, no longer just another waitress lost in the background. Others, still caught in the moment, whispered about the kind of voice that didn't just entertain. It commanded respect. Jonathan Pierce sat motionless. His men had started talking again, awkwardly attempting to fill the silence he had left behind. But there was no ignoring the fact that something had changed. The dynamic had shifted. The power he had wielded so effortlessly just minutes ago, the dominance he thrived on, was gone. His influence, his wealth, his reputation, none of it mattered here. Not tonight. The pile of money on the table, once a mockery, now looked like an insult to himself. His fingers twitched slightly, as if debating whether to shove it back into his pocket. A silent acknowledgement of his own foolishness, but he didn't move. Because for the first time in his life, Jonathan Pierce didn't know what to do. A server approached the table, clearing plates with quiet efficiency. Unlike earlier, he didn't rush to please. He didn't act carefully, fearing Jonathan's reaction. Instead, his voice was calm, indifferent. "Would you like anything else, sir?" It was such a simple question, but to Jonathan, it felt like a slap. No deference, no hesitation, no fear. The man who had spent his entire life bending the world to his will had just been reduced to nothing more than a customer. And suddenly, he understood. Respect wasn't something you could buy. The restaurant moved on, but the moment lingered. It clung to the air like the final echoes of a melody, refusing to fade completely. Jonathan Pierce didn't move. His drink, once a source of smug satisfaction, sat untouched before him. He had walked into Monroe's prime believing himself untouchable. But now, all he could feel was the crushing weight of something he had never experienced before. Humiliation. It wasn't the kind that came from being yelled at or insulted. No, this was worse. Because Elena Carter hadn't fought back. She hadn't snapped. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't begged or pleaded. She had simply shown him that his power, his status, his wealth, none of it meant anything. And she had done it without ever needing to say a word to him. Across the room, the restaurant manager had been watching. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes said everything. He knew what had just happened. He also knew one more thing. The next time Jonathan Pierce walked into Monroe's prime, the staff wouldn't rush to serve him, because respect, once lost, was nearly impossible to reclaim. At another table, an older woman gently touched Elena's arm as she passed. Her voice was warm, filled with something that wasn't just admiration. It was understanding. "That was beautiful, dear," she said softly. "Truly beautiful." Elena smiled. Not for Jonathan, not for the applause, but for herself. She hadn't just endured tonight. She had owned it. And as for Jonathan Pierce, he would leave that night knowing a truth that no amount of money could erase. True power doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from knowing who you are and never letting anyone take that away from you. Jonathan Pierce walked out of Monroe's prime that night, but the weight of what had happened followed him. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was exposure. For the first time in his life, he had been made to feel small. And the worst part? No one had to put him in his place. He had done it to himself. Elena Carter, meanwhile, never looked back. She continued moving through the restaurant, the same way she had before. But something was different. People saw her now, not as a waitress, not as a servant, but as a woman who carried herself with dignity, grace, and strength. And that was a kind of power Jonathan Pierce would never understand. If this story resonated with you, remember, dignity and talent will always rise above arrogance. True power doesn't come from money or status. It comes from how you carry yourself in the face of disrespect. What did this story make you feel? Let me know in the comments. And if you love powerful narratives like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and share, because some stories deserve to be told.